So in order to now replace this dummy fallback data with some more realistic data, we can go to this tasks component, which is responsible for outputting all those individual tasks, and simply add and manage a tasks array here. So in the tasks component class, we can add a new tasks property, for example. Of course, the name is up to you though. And then set this equal to an array where we could already add some dummy tasks if we wanted to. For example, a task with an ID of T1 with a title of Master Angular. And then maybe a summary of learn all the basic and advanced features of Angular and how to apply them. Anything like that. I also want to add a due date property here to this task object so that we can output such a date for every task. And that could be 2025 and then maybe December 31st. Whatever, something like this. Now, every task should also be assigned to a user. Therefore, every task object should also have a user ID property, which could be U1 for the first task, so that it's assigned to the user with the ID U1, because we need to store this relation to make sure that different users have different tasks. And of course, we can now simply copy and paste that, though to save you some time, I prepared 2 additional dummy tasks which you find attached. So that in the end, your tasks array should look like this, with these 3 dummy tasks. Well, and now that we do have those dummy tasks here, we can and should of course go to the tasks component template. And instead of outputting those task components like this, we can now again output a dynamic list with add4. Because now we can go through all those tasks and track the task IDs to have some unique identifier. And then output a list item with the app task inside of it for every task. Now, with that, not much will change though. We'll still output 3 tasks for every user, no matter which user we select, because we're always outputting all the tasks for all the users. And we have 3 tasks here, so it's 3 tasks we're outputting for every user. Now, of course, what we typically would want to do instead is that we don't output all the tasks for all users, but instead only the tasks that belong to a certain user. And we can achieve this by accepting another input here. And that input would be the ID of the selected user. And indeed now we can actually also make this both required again, since we now, due to the way the application works at this time, always know that we definitely should have an ID and a name whenever this tasks component is being rendered. But now that we also got this ID of the user for whom we're displaying this tasks component in the end, we can also add another computed property, another getter, which could be called selected user tasks, where we return this .tasks, and then we filter them for the tasks that belong to the user. And filter is another built-in method built into JavaScript. Like find, filter takes a function as an argument, and like the function you pass to find, this function you pass to filter will be executed once for every item in this array and will then receive that item, so that task in this case here, for which it is being executed. And we then have to return true if we want to keep the item in this filtered array or if we want to not have it there. And here my condition therefore is to check whether the user ID is equal to this .id. So to the user ID we receive as an input here. And of course, we could name this user ID here instead of just ID to make it really clear that this will be the ID of a user. With that change made, we have to go back to the app component template where we're using our tasks here. And we now also have to bind the user ID property we just added. And bind that to selected user.id in this case. Now with that, we are able to filter out the tasks that belong to a user. And we can now use this selected user tasks property here in the template of this tasks component, in this loop here specifically. So instead of going through all the tasks we possibly know, we now want to go only through the tasks of the selected user. And with those changes made, if you save all files, you will see that different users now have different amounts of tasks. We still don't output the task data here, we still just got the dummy text here, but that will change soon. But at least we are now outputting the tasks that do belong to the different users. Now that we are able to output the tasks that belong to a user, we of course also want to pass that task data to that task component so that in that task component template, we output the actual task title and time and so on instead of that dummy data. And therefore, in that task component TypeScript file here, we of course should accept that data that we want to output as input. Hence, I'll import the input decorator and then add a new input. And now we have some options. We could add one input per piece of data we want to output. So one for the title, one for the time, and one for the summary. We could do that. But alternatively, we could also just accept the entire task object as an input and then pull out the pieces of data we need inside of this task component. And that's what I'll do here. So I expect to get a task property. But of course, now we have to define the type of this task. And that type is the type we in the end define here in the tasks component. It's this object shape here that we want, just translated to a type. So what we can do is go back to the task component and again add our own custom object type, either with the type keyword or with the interface keyword. I'll name it task here. And then every task should have an ID, a user ID, a title, a summary, and a due date, and all the values are strings. So here it's ID of type string, user ID of type string, title of type string, summary of type string, and due date of type string. And then we can use this task interface here as a type for this input. Now we also have to add an exclamation mark if we know that we'll always get a task. And here I do know that this will be the case because I will also mark this input as required. With that, we can and have to go back to the tasks component HTML file and now bind this newly added task property to such a task object. And conveniently, that is of course what we're getting here. This task we're getting here from that selected user tasks list is such a task object which we then pass as a value for this task property. Now, of course, in order to see that task content on the screen, we then also have to go to the template of the task component. And instead of outputting task title as a dummy text like this, we can use string interpolation to output task dot title, referring to that task property we're receiving as an input, which will be of type task and which will therefore have a title property. And similarly, here we can output the task due date and here the task summary, like this. If you save that, you therefore now should see the actual task data being output for the users that have tasks. Now, in the previous lecture, I added this task interface here, this custom task type definition in the end. And we did something similar earlier for the user type here in the user component file. Now, whilst you can do it like this, it is quite common in Angular apps to outsource crucial type definitions like these into separate files. It's not a technical requirement, as you can tell, since everything works, and it's also not something you have to do, but it is a common pattern. And I'll start with this user type here. You would typically create a separate file in the folder to which this data model belongs. So if you're describing a user, it makes sense to be stored in the user folder. You would add a new file here and then typically name it user.model.ts. And now you can simply cut this interface here, this user interface, and also delete this commented out type since we don't need it, and paste that interface into this user model file. Now, in order to make it available outside of this file, you also have to add the export keyword though. And now with this, the advantage is that you can now easily use this type definition in any file that needs it. In this app, it is only that one user component file, so it's not too important. But if you were using that same data model, that same data type in different files, defining it in a central place like this and exporting it simply makes sure that you don't have to copy and paste type definitions around. Therefore now, with that type being stored in that extra file, we have to import this user data definition from /user.model, and with that everything works again. And that's also important. When working with TypeScript, you can import type definitions, just as you can import classes and so on. If you know that something is a type definition, you can add the type keyword in front of it to make that super clear, though technically this is not required. But you might want to do that to make it very clear that what we're importing here is just a type definition. And you can now do something similar for the task. And you can, of course, also try doing this on your own first. I will outsource it by, again, grabbing this interface here so that it's not in the task component file anymore. And now, since I'm describing a task, I'll stay in this task subfolder. And in there, I'll add a task.model.ts file. And then, just as before, we put the interface in there and export it. And now in the file where we need it, we can import it. So here in the task component file, we import this type task from /task.model. And again, as mentioned, this is not something you have to do, but a common pattern you will see in many Angular applications.